Franz Kafka. Letters to Milena. Dear Frau Milena, to begin with, so that you don't deduce it from my letter against my will, for about 14 days now I have had increasing insomnia. I generally don't take it badly. Times like this come and go. They also always have a few more explanations than they really need. This is ridiculous, but according to Baedeker, it can even be the air in Meran. And even if they frequently are just barely visible, all these causes can still make one as dull as a block of wood, and at the same time as restless as a beast of the forest. However, I do have one compensation. You have slept peacefully, even if somewhat oddly. Even if yesterday you were still out of sorts. Nonetheless, your sleep was peaceful. So when sleep passes over me in the night, I know where it is headed, and accept this. Of course, it would be stupid to resist. Sleep is the most innocent creature there is, and a sleepless man the most guilty. And you thank this sleepless man in your last letter? If an uninitiated stranger were to read it, he'd have to think, what a man! He must have moved mountains here. But meanwhile, he hasn't done a thing, hasn't lifted a finger, except to write, is living off milk and good things, without always, although often, seeing tea and apples. And in general, he lets things take their course, and leaves the mountains alone. Do you know the story of Dostoevsky's first success? It encompasses a great many things. What's more, I cite it only because the great name makes it easy to do so. For a story from next door, or even closer, would have the same significance. Incidentally, my memory of the story, and even the names, is inexact. When Dostoevsky wrote his first novel, Poor Folk, he was living with his friend Grigoriev, a man of letters. The latter watched for months as the written pages accumulated on the desk, but didn't receive the manuscript until it was finished. He read the novel, was delighted, and took it to Nekrasov, a famous contemporary critic, without saying anything to Dostoevsky. That night at 3 o'clock, the doorbell rings at Dostoevsky's. It's Grigoriev and Nekrasov. They push their way into the room, embrace and kiss Dostoevsky. Nekrasov, who hadn't known him before, calls him the hope of Russia. They spend 1 or 2 hours talking mostly about the novel, and don't leave until morning. Dostoevsky, who always described this night as the happiest in his life, leans out of the window to watch them leave, loses control, and starts to cry. His basic feeling at that moment, which he describes, although I forget where, was something like, "These wonderful people, they're so good and noble, and I am so mean. If they could only see inside me. And even if I simply tell them, they won't believe me." The fact that Dostoevsky later undertook to emulate them is merely embellishment, merely the last word that youth demands in its invincibility, and is no longer part of my story, which consequently ends here. Do you, dear Frau Milena, see the mystery in this story? Do you see what reason cannot grasp? I think it is this. As far as we can generalize, Grigoriev and Nekrasov were certainly no nobler than Dostoevsky. But now leave the general overview aside, which even Dostoevsky didn't demand that night, and which is useless in specific cases. Concentrate solely on Dostoevsky, and you will be convinced that Grigoriev and Nekrasov really are wonderful, that Dostoevsky was impure, infinitely mean, that he would never even come close to catching up with Grigoriev and Nekrasov, let alone repay them for their monstrously kind, undeserved good deed. You can actually see them from the window as they walk away, thereby indicating their unapproachability. Unfortunately, the meaning of the story is obliterated by the great name Dostoevsky. Where did my insomnia lead me? I'm sure to nothing that was not very well meant. Franz K.